Hey, Catherine,
Yeah,
the moment they start putting serving sizes on a bottle of wine,
yeah.
I'm afraid I'm going to be that family of four.
4 servings.
Four servings, yeah. Like, well, I got a family of four at home, so that's why this is, yeah. No, I'm all about moderation, and that joke was kind of moderate, honestly.
It was immoderate.
Immoderate, yes.
That's right, listeners. Martín Reyes, master of wine and dad jokes as well, is back at the Four Top. We are a two top today, but we are going to break a big wine issue down into 4 pieces. So it'll all make sense.
Yep, it's just you and me, Catherine. And hey, have you ever noticed that cigarette warnings, those labels have become increasingly graphic and grisly, and especially in other countries when I visited Canada and Australia? Ooh, man.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those that are scary. Those images of rotting teeth, diseased lungs, tumors sometimes. But hey, studies have shown that those cigarette warning labels, those really graphic images, do deter people from becoming smokers. So I guess I'm all for them.
Well, but what if we saw that same sort of image, say, I don't know, depicting liver cancer on wine bottles?
Oh, no. Hold on there. Our vice is pure. It is immaculate. We
Oh,
should be
yeah?
able to we should be able to evade and bypass any regulation because wine is special.
That's true. It's special. But, it does look like, for instance, speaking of Australia, the federal government there may be slapping warning labels onto bottles and cans of alcohol soon. Ireland has already passed legislation requiring comprehensive health labeling on alcoholic beverages. Of course, in the US, we have a statement that it's regulated by the Surgeon General. But they're going to go further. These labels include information such as calorie content, grams of alcohol, the risks of consuming alcohol while pregnant, which again we have, and also the dangers of liver disease and cancers caused by alcohol, throat cancer, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, between Ireland and the EU, I am just seeing labeling in the news a lot recently. I mean, listeners may remember from episode 129 that the EU is requiring ingredient labels on alcohol as of December 8, 2023. And there has been recently a big fracas around this because there was this
That's how you pronounce it.
miscommunication. Huh?
No, that's how you pronounce that word. Anyways, go on.
I
I
used to
mean,
pronounce it fracas, but I've heard
so did I.
fracas.
That's
Oh,
apparently it's a fracas the way we used to pronounce it. Anyway, go on.
oh
Hundred of
my
million,
gosh.
hundreds of millions
I
of wine
should look
labels.
it
What?
up. Okay, listeners, let
But
me know if I mispronounced that. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of
we'll make a
myself. I think
fracas out of you and me. Anyway, go ahead.
Martin, let's have a fracas. Let's have an
let's
old school
let's
talk show about labels.
Let's do that because I have lots of thoughts. I'm sure you do too about health in general, which we'll get to later on this season. Okay, about the health aspects of wine, but particularly the health information on wine labels. Let's record a classic four top right now, shall we?
Okay, except it's a two top.
Fine, right, whatever. But let's just talk it out.
Okay, so Martin, we are going to talk about information on wine labels this week. So let's start by looking at health warnings. So, as you mentioned at the top of the show, in May, Ireland rolled out the first comprehensive health labeling on alcoholic products. These labels include information, as you mentioned, such as calorie content, grams of alcohol, the risks of consuming these beverages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And well, it turns out that Ireland is ranked fourth in the world for alcohol consumption, according to the World Health Organization. So this may be a move to warn folks about the risks posed by, let's be clear, heavy alcohol consumption. And that's probably warranted in this area, yes, in this country.
Yeah, and when I read that, of course, I had to put on my reporter hat and go on a little tangent. I apologize, everyone, but I did check out the statistics on alcohol use and abuse around the world. And outside of Ireland, the top 10 highest alcohol consuming nations are, surprise, they're all in Eastern Europe. I shouldn't be laughing,
Mm-hmm.
it's sad. The grand prize goes to the Republic of Moldova, where the average citizen over the age of 15 drinks an average of 15.1 liters of pure alcohol per year. Now, if you do the math, that's the equivalent of 167 bottles of wine a year. And they're saying over the age of 15, so that means the average
Average.
16-year-old drinks half a bottle of wine a day. The
The average
average
for everybody, grannies, teenagers, kids, everybody. Wow, right? Man,
that's a
what a
lot.
party. Yeah.
And the runners up are Bulgaria, Romania, and then Ireland, as we mentioned, then Latvia, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, and then Russia comes in at number 10.
Okay, so as far as I know, citizens of those nations are more likely to be knocking back some booze than wine potentially. I don't know, but six of those top 10 are members of the EU: Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Romania. So I can see why the EU might be motivated to add warning labels about the overconsumption of alcohol. I'm going to say that word overconsumption as a seed for the next episode I jump on with
Yeah.
you on. But instead of it's a starting point, right? They have rolled out compulsory ingredient and nutrition labels on wines as of December 8th, 23. These are just like the nutrition labels that we see on the back of food items, listing like allergens, calories, nutritional value, and of course, ingredients.
Yeah, and listeners, I know we have a lot of industry listeners, so please take note this requirement applies to producers exporting their wines to the EU as well. So if you're exporting your
Hmm.
wine to Europe, heed this heed this episode. Many wineries were all ready to go before December 8 with their new labels, and typically the solution was to put a QR code on that back label with a little eye symbol in the middle, and maybe we can post that on our social media feed. And the I stood for ingredients, or maybe you could interpret it as information. But just 2 weeks before the law went into effect, the European Commission basically blindsided wineries by stating that that I was not sufficient, that I symbol, and they should have the entire word ingredients on the label for clarity. And I guess they have a point. Like when I see a QR code on a product, I assume it has something to do with marketing, typically, not nutrition, but the timing was abysmal.
You missed it, Catherine. You could have said I for one. Wine businesses were understandably pissed off. They told the drinks business that if you do this now, you force us hundreds of millions of wine labels, including those on bottles already, would have to be destroyed as a result of this late breaking change. So it's still an issue that caused a fracas. It's still an issue that's being resolved as we speak. And if you follow the news, you would see that. You'll see where things are now, which we won't dive into that because that's not what issue is about. We're thinking about back labels this week, right? So I want to dig
Yeah.
into the bigger question of ingredients, ingredient listing on wine labels. Why aren't they there? Should they be there?
Yeah. And so, this is the four top. So maybe let's break this conversation into four parts.
Four tops, four conversations. Let's
Okay.
do it. Four parts. Yeah.
Four top icks. I
Ooh, I like it.
propose, I propose
Well
first
done.
the question: do consumers actually want information
Mhm.
on their wine labels? And do wineries want to provide it? Second, what ingredient or nutrition information would it be relevant to include on wine labels? And then third and fourth, how about one of us argues for additional information on wine labels and one
Hmm.
of us argues against?
I like that. I'm game. Let's do it. This ad brought to you by the makers of back labels, sticking it to the bottle one label at a time.
Nice.
Okay, Catherine. So, do consumers actually want nutritional information on wine labels?
I think they do. I mean, I'm thinking about health. I have a kid with a life threatening food allergy. So I get that allergens are a real thing that people need to check for. And there are some surprising ingredients that come into contact with wine that most consumers would not think of, potentially allergenic substances such as egg whites, potassium caseinate, I can't say that, which is derived from milk, isinglass, which is a fish bladder. These are all used as fining or clarifying agents. So they're not exactly ingredients, but they do come in contact with wine in many cases, depending on the winemaker's procedure. So we found a paper published in 2015 by a group of Spanish and Italian researchers that concluded that the risks to allergy sufferers are negligible, but there are a few cases in which residue is accidentally left in the wine, and that can be, a risk to folks with life-threatening allergies.
Isinglass is like it's like a finding agent for Lord of the Rings, the Isinglass
I know.
stone. And so, for that eventuality you just spoke about, the EU, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, they require that traces of more than a quarter of a percent of egg and milk finding agents be listed on labels. There's also a bunch of other health reasons too, right? Calorie counting, carbs, sugar consumption, when wines contain sugar. Not all of them do, most of them don't, but they might just want to be looking at eating, clean or drinking clean, as they say these days, which is a topic we covered. Maybe they just want to focus on their diet, and or considering what the additives are in their wine.
Yeah, a lot of people are just focusing on quote unquote whole foods, clean foods,
Mm.
and it's not our place to judge that. Although, as the wine industry is well aware, clean wines are getting quite a bit of attention these days, and we have talked about that on the foretop. But in addition to nutritional or health concerns, there are also moral reasons for listing ingredients. Vegetarians and vegans, they
Hmm.
may not want to consume a wine that was fined with egg whites or fish bladders.
Yes, and then there's the educational component. Finally, we're wine geeks here. Occasionally, I want to know if there's any pre-fermentation additives, yeasts, acids, or water. Sometimes has been added for various reasons. And I used to make wine, so I understand that some of these things oftentimes are corrective to make the wine taste better, or stabilize the wine, like SO2, Velcorin, which is a preservative, and styling agents, oak chips, mega purple, things like that. Last time I checked, for instance, the EU lists, gosh, the number keeps growing. It's 60, maybe 70 ingredients in wine, while the US allows for that or a little bit more.
Yeah, as a wine enthusiast, I kind of want to know if my glass contains mega purple or oak essence, or maybe I don't want to know. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then there's also the matter of consumer rights, right? People do not want to feel like they are being fed lies, understandably. And so food regulations, they stem from, demand for transparency, standardized labeling formats, ingredient listings in order of decreasing volume. They reduce deceptive practices, and they, in theory, should reduce consumer confusion.
Yes. And Martin, I want to thank you because I know you wrote an MW paper on this subject, and that really informed this episode. So I
You're not
appreciate
supposed
all.
to say the secrets. That's a secret. That's secret ingredient to this episode.
Well, you just know this topic really well, so I appreciate that.
Well,
Um,
it was written a few years ago, but thank you.
So I feel like I got to go back and remember what the 4 points we wanted to hit were. So I feel like we hit points 1 and 2. Do consumers actually want this information? Do wineries want to provide it? Well, we need to talk about that in a moment. And then what information should be included? I think I've got a sense of all those, of the answer to all those questions. So now let's argue
Hmm.
for and against ingredient labels on wine.
Let's get into a fight.
Yeah, let's do it.
Tit for
A
tat.
debate, a friendly debate,
A debate. A
a
friendly
fracas.
debate. Let's label it fracas instead of a fight. Good point.
It's going to be so embarrassing if all our listeners let me know that I've been mispronouncing this word.
Well, it reminds me of like gala. Is it gala, gala, gala? That kind of thing.
Oh,
Anyways,
that's an East Coast, West Coast thing. It's gala on the
uh,
East Coast.
it's
Any
gala.
hoodles,
Anyway,
any
yeah.
hoodles. I feel like I've got an easy one here because since I do have a kid who could die if she comes in contact with peanuts, I actually have a food allergy as well, but it's not a life or death thing. So for me, it's like I love you, wine industry, but if my kid were allergic to eggs, fish, or milk, I would be pretty furious to know that trace amounts of these substances could occasionally be found in wine because as a consumer I would never in a million years imagine that there might be traces of fish or eggs or milk in wine. And I know winemakers are thinking, "Oh, it's not actually in it." But there's the 1 in a million chance that trace amounts are left and someone who's very allergic comes into contact with them, and I just think it's never worth taking that chance. And of course, if I were concerned with my health for other reasons, yeah, I guess I'd be curious to know about sugar, carb, and calorie counts, but it's part of me is kind of like if you're that obsessed with your diet, why are you drinking wine? I don't know. That's not for me to judge. But as we discussed in episode 128, it is known that the hottest wine right now in the United States is Aveline, which is this wine that is marketed as clean and lists its ingredients on the back label.
Mm.
So I don't think it's a bad thing to list ingredients. It seems to be a positive, and consumers seem to really react positively to it if you're making your wine with very few additives.
Okay, you've argued your point well. Thank you, Catherine,
You're
and I'm
welcome.
almost convinced. Well, I should clarify. It's it. I think that part of the spirit of this episode and this format for type is to look at both sides objectively and construct arguments for and against. not necessarily falling on one or the other. And this is precisely the kind of topic that isn't perfect, and there isn't a tidy solution, which is what makes it interesting and fascinating. So I'm going to argue for, or rather against ingredient labeling, essentially for the status quo now. One clarification, of course, is that I don't disagree because of safety issues. I do agree that that part can and should be for public safety included.
Mm,
I'm not going to argue against that. I can't. So
mhm,
I should just draw the line there. But there are, well, there's I think there's reasons why we leave things as they are. One could argue that in the quest for clarity, you end up actually confusing a consumer. Again, not for safety, but just for the unintended negative consequence. How is it standardized
mm.
and transmitted across the supply chain? There's bureaucratic wrangling, there's watered down terms that would then mean next to nothing, and there's unintended consequences. Even as producers, for instance, if you add water and acid to adjust the acidity in a wine,
Mhm.
are you watering down that wine? Are you diluting the flavor? That's what consumers are going to read into that, when in fact the water is a minimal part of
And
the
and w
adjustment.
and it's a liquid, so, like, did they even mention water when like, on the back of a juice? I don't even know if you buy juice, d
I think they do. Listeners can correct us, but the way to apply acid in wine, and it's a very common practice in California. I've done it. Lots of famous wineries. I've done it, especially if you want, as far as climate change is concerned. Sometimes acid drops below levels that we want, which we don't want to geek out on that. But the acidity is adjusted via the vehicle of water. It's a nominal adjustment. Frankly, wine is 84% water, so it's part of the process, but it doesn't dilute the flavor. As a matter of fact, it enhances the overall quality of the wine. It's not something we talk about because of the romantic and mysterious winemaking processes where it's just grapes, squish them, and walk away and come back. But it does raise potentially unnecessary consumer fears and confusion around these processes. Again, I'm not citing for it or against. I'm presenting what is a possible argument against ingredient labeling.
I mean, that's a good point because already there's so many hurdles to overcome in terms of educating the public about wine because it is such a confusing topic, and now it's adding another hurdle.
Right, and then also the question of the yeast, and sulfites are there, of course, right? But the yeast, there is this recent obsession around sommeliers, and therefore I think maybe trickling up or down for consumers. Where is my wine inoculated with farmed yeast, or is it ambient yeasts? Let's step aside for a minute the fact that most of the time the cultured yeast take over anyway
Mm,
in most wineries, but we won't get into that issue. The fact is that there are reasons, good reasons why, for instance, champagne, some sparkling wines, a few different styles require to be inoculated by cultured yeast to make that specific style.
mhm.
And so you have this potential deterrent. Well, I'm not going to make sparkling wine because then I'm going to have to put on that I included yeast. People are going to think that I am faking my wines or that I'm not authentic. When it invites a lot of these consumer fears that might complicate the conversation, between the wineries and consumers.
That's an interesting
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that because ambient yeast, that's still yeast and it still is sort of a natural addition. It just sort of happens naturally.
Right.
So,
Yes, and by
hmm.
the way, to be clear, these are not GMO yeast, and a lot of slick marketing I've seen that say, okay, there's no GMOs in our wine. Well, wine right now in general does not have any GMOs. Most of the wine we drink today, and those yeast that have been cultured, they're not genetically altered. They're cultivated the way that they're breeds that work for us, the way that breeds of dogs
Mhm.
are not natural in nature. They've been bred over a certain time to produce desired effects, but they are naturally occurring. They just breed them. Same thing with yeast.
So
Uh,
if you have a labradoodle, you are not allowed to only drink natural wine.
there you go. Right, that's true. And I think that the clean wine movement has scared a lot of consumers into thinking that most wines are dripping full of toxic sugars and
Mhm.
nasty ingredients, and so therefore there's this reaction of potentially like no ingredients are other than grape grapes, and occasionally sulfites in yeast are good or not. And mm,
Well, I have to
it-
say, what are we doing naming things? Is Velcorin, is that a brand name or is
mm.
that just sounds scary.
Oh yeah, well that's the brand name. It's dimethyl di. It's dimethyl something, and I forget the technical term. And it is a scary sounding thing. Winemakers euphemistically call it the Death Star because it goes in and just it neutralizes all most I should say most pathogens. There's other
Just put
things
that on
that
the back label.
yeah, right. And well, here's the funny thing though. Velcorin has been used for decades in other liquids that people consume. Orange juices, milks. I'm not sure about milks, but I know that juices and some beverages that people consume now have been dosed with Velcorin,
Mhm.
and Velcorin then it breaks down into harmless components. By the way, I am not a scientist. I'm telling you what the people who make Velcorin tell me.
Mm.
So I'm not debating whether it's true or not. I'm telling you exactly what I have been taught by the manufacturer of Velcorin. So it breaks down, but it
Who's not
before it
paying
breaks
us,
down,
by the way, but if they
I
want to
don't
sponsor
know.
the Four Topper.
But it does sound kind of nasty, right? Like it goes in and just kills all the microorganisms that exist in wine to make it stable so that it doesn't either re-ferment or it doesn't turn nasty or doesn't get a little funky in the bottle once the consumer wants it. Most consumers of wine want their product to be relatively stable, that it's going to be the same as I drank it last week when I bought it from the same store. And oftentimes, that's why we filter. That's why
Mhm.
we fine, and that's why some people use Velcorin. It gets pretty geeky, but the point is, you're right. When you stop and think about what Velcorin does, it sounds nasty,
Mhm.
and people probably would want to say, "Yes, can you tell me if you use the Death Star on my wine or not?"
But these same people probably don't want to drink curdled milk.
Correct. And some people are drinking the juices that have been hit by the Death Star that are
Mhm.
not wine, which is interesting.
Mhm. Hmm.
Fascinatingly, we should come out and say the one thing that all of us in the wine industry have a pet peeve around is sulfites. People, chill the fuck out about sulfites. Seriously, seriously. If you have an allergy to sulfites, a genuine allergy to sulfites, wine is among the least of your concerns. There are potato chips, salads, beers, candies, all sorts of things that have vastly more milligrams per liter of sulfites in them than wine. We for some reason got maligned in the way. I have no idea why, but just look into the research before you start bagging on sulfites. They're essentially mostly, for most of us, harmless, and they're a preservative that has been used for thousands of years since Roman times. They
Yeah, and
effectively are almost like. Go ahead.
well, I
I
was just
talked
gonna
too
say,
much.
and if you wanna know what causes red wine headaches, just listen to episode 129, and
Exactly.
all will be revealed.
Right. So we've bludgeoned some of the misconceptions as well as highlighted some of the things that people may want about their ingredients. The fact is, most of the time they are considered harmless, both regulatory and otherwise. The other thing that we haven't talked about is higher costs of managing the information, the red tape, the bureaucratic wrangling around ingredient labeling that will add a cost to the consumer. There's already all kinds of compliance around labels that are required, things that are required on labels. And people, for the most part, sometimes say wine labels are already too confusing. And they're crowded with a bunch of text, small little text, 1, 2 millimeter texts that you can barely read. And then now you're adding another layer of information. For most of the consumers who consider wine a pleasurable beverage, it's a little too much for them. Goes a bit too far. I mean, is it a cumbersome and ultimately pointless exercise for wine producers and potentially a detriment to the general consumers? Or do we have to consider which types of wines have labeling? No, I get no. That's a. Just delete that comment. That's not good.
Well, I was gonna say in there, I do like the solution of the QR code because then
Hmm.
you're not adding too much junk to the back label, and those
Hmm.
consumers who want the information can get it, but it's not you're not inundating people who are gonna be overwhelmed by information. You're not giving them more than they want.
Yeah, the inventor of the QR code, man, they were shitting bricks a few years ago, right? Nobody was using it. It was a
Hmm.
dead. I felt like it was this sort of waning thing that we're like, there went that. And all of a sudden, COVID hit, and all of a sudden, we're using QR codes everywhere. And you're right, there is we're using it for business cards, these days often. And so, yeah, if it's on the back of a label, as the EU has stated, and I'm an importer, we're going to be bringing in wines with QR codes on the back in a few years. It's going to be de rigueur.
Oui, oui.
Did I
Ouais,
pronounce that
ouais.
correctly?
I understand also that consumers don't necessarily want ingredients on their wine.
Well, yeah, that is something that my good friend and awesome writer in the wine business, and somebody who's an authority in this area, Liz Tosh, wrote a piece about. Tell us more about what she says, Catherine.
Yeah, I just pulled that article up. I love Liz's work. She says that the results show that 38% of US consumers believe ingredient lists should be included for wine, as opposed to 42% for beer, 57% for hard seltzers, and 60% for ready to drink cocktails. And this is according to Christian Miller, research director for Wine Market Council. So that's interesting. So people are, the majority of US consumers don't really care about ingredient lists on wine, but they do care about cocktails and hard seltzers, which I think that makes sense.
So Liz also does cover. She writes about the costs that I know we alluded to earlier. The redesigning the packages. Of course, QR codes is a potential solution down the line, but then the documentation, right, about how to keep track of whatever the ingredients are. And sometimes certain vintages, people use different ingredients. For instance, acid is probably one of the most common ingredients added. Tartaric acid specifically is one of the most common ingredients added to wines from warmer regions. And sometimes you can add it, sometimes you don't have to. So the labels have to kind of go back and forth each year to address that. So there's added cost to that documentation.
Martin, you keep mentioning acid, but I'm in Oregon. I'm in the Willamette Valley, so my counterpart to that would be sugar because sometimes it's so freaking
Sugar,
cold
right?
here. We can't get to the ripeness.
We,
But then people think the wine is
yes.
sweet, and of course, it's perfectly dry.
By the way, for the listeners, not sugar that stays in the wine. It's sugar added to increase the alcohol content because otherwise it's a little sometimes underripe. So
Hmm.
most of the time, the wines that we drink, Chards, Pinots, Cabs, all that stuff that we have, Malbecs, most of them have less than 1% sugar. Let's get that out there straight right now. It's dry. It's just unfermentable because the yeast can't get to it. There are 5 carbon sugars versus 6. It gets all this weird kind of stuff. But so it's not sugar that's being added to make it sweet. Usually, I should say, usually it's sugar to increase the volume and the texture of the wine because that sugar is then fermented into alcohol and develops into the 12 or 13 or 14% into real quote unquote expected wine. So let's be clear about that.
Okay, so what I'm taking away from this conversation is that it's really complicated. And I know that it's complicated to make any food product or any beverage product, but because of fermentation, wine is super, super complicated. And so it seems like we keep coming up with these ingredients that we feel like maybe should be listed, but it would be
Hmm.
misleading to list them, like fining agents, because they're not actually in the wine. And, an addition of sugar that's not actually in the wine, it's
Hmm.
feeding the fermentation.
Yeah, sometimes vitamins for the yeast because occasionally there's a whole bunch of reasons why we didn't even get into tannins or color corrections. Like you said, Catherine, it's complicated. They're still derived by and most of the time natural plants, and sometimes the tannins come from oak
Mm,
that is usually in your wine too, because the flavor of oak, this oak that seeps in through barrels, it's
mhm.
similar tannins as those. So there is this link to nature from some of these additives that makes a lot of wines taste yummy. I know the pushback, authenticity, right? I get that. This is the reason why this is kind of a cool episode. It goes back and forth. Do you want your wine to taste a certain way, or do you want it to be stripped of everything and just have this bare boned clean, not clean, but authentic, nothing added, nothing taken away. And there's an appeal to that. But
Mhm.
there's also an appeal to just having a delicious, tasty, safe beverage. And there you have it.
Okay, so Martin, my question to close this out is
Mm.
when you get that first bottle of European wine with the QR code, are you going to grab your phone and go look at that ingredients list?
Putting myself into the consumer's shoes? No.
I think you're right. But as a former wine journalist, I guess I still am sort of. As a recovering wine journalist, hell yes. I want to know what's in
Yeah.
there.
I do too. I certainly do too. And let's not paint all consumers with a broad brush. I'm thinking about what the majority would say.
Mhm.
There's certainly a segment of the consumer population in the world, not just the U.S., that is increasingly concerned about the intention of the winemaker. There's so many wines out there. Everyone's gotten the gist. The quality has risen. Labels are equally vying for your attention at the supermarket shelf or in the restaurant. How do they stand apart? How do you pick? Oftentimes, eventually, it comes down to the emotional connection. Well, what's an emotion? The story. Well, what kind of story? The intention. Well, what's your intention? Authenticity, or what? Right. That is where, for a certain kind of consumer, they do want to know how much you've quote unquote manipulated
Mhm.
your wine. So there will be those who will say, oh, and sometimes it's not just the ingredients, but the story. The QR code can go to anything. So if there's a QR code that signals to the consumer, there's more here. So the more here beyond the flavor, beyond the pleasure, beyond the taste, beyond even the terroir. It's who are you? Whose intention am I drinking? Are you organic? Are you biodynamic? What ingredients are you using? Are you treating your workers fairly? Right? All those things that we covered last season are coming into relief, and we are grappling as an industry with that ourselves. And this consumer knows that, and
Mhm.
the QR codes is, and the ingredient labeling, this whole topic is signaling that we're having that discussion in real time.
All right. So what if you get a bottle of wine from Australia or somewhere and the instead of the beautiful label, it just has a giant picture of a cancerous liver.
That's foreshadowing a future episode in which we talk about the big hullabaloo of wine and health.
I cannot wait
That's coming up.
to
That's
record
coming up
that with you,
next.
Martin. We're going to
Yeah,
talk about life expectancy, cancer risk, health, wine, how they all fit together.
can't
That's
wait
going to
for
be a
that
good
one.
one. Well, for now, I'm thinking we can wrap that up. I feel like we had some pretty good arguments for and against ingredient labeling. And regardless of our arguments, it's happening in Europe. So, maybe coming to the US soon, who knows? So, lots to think about. But now it is time for our dessert course. And Martin, you haven't been with us these last couple episodes, but we're only
Hmm.
doing one dessert course per episode now. Would you like to do the honors?
Oh my gosh. It's been a hot minute since I've thrown this out. And so this might be a repeat. I don't know. And frankly, I don't care. I'm going to say it again. I'm going to bring it up again if I have spoken about it. It's called Zero Acre Cooking Oil. I sound like Zero Acre Cooking Oil, ladies and gentlemen. No, this is pretty bitchin' stuff. It's basically, speaking of fermentation, it's an all-purpose cooking oil with like skyrocketing, off the charts good monosaturated fats,
Hmm.
more so than olive oil, a high smoke point. We all know about that. We all care about that, and a neutral taste, excuse me, that works on every recipe.
Hmm.
The really cool thing about it, it's seed oil free. It's non-GMO. It is vegan, um, and it's actually fermented. It is also carbon friendly.
Hmm.
Um, and it's made from sugarcane plants. It's got like 93% monosaturated fats, and it comes in the mail, a couple of them in a year. It's goes from sugar, speaking of, to oil through that fermentation process. Um, and my gosh, if you go to zeroacre.com and be prepared to be convinced like I was. I'm using this on all my cooking oils for all my cooking these days.
Hmm. I'm at the website and I'm trying to find a back label because now I'm curious. This is an oil made from sugarcane.
Yeah.
So, talk about a confusing label for consumers.
Hmm.
Ingredients are sugar, and it's a fat. That's
Right.
pretty cool.
The magic of fermentation.
I didn't know you could ferment oil.
I didn't either, honestly. So this is a lesson for all of us.
Okay, if you hear clicking in the background, it's because I'm typing. I'm now so curious. I'm dying to know. Rain-fed sugarcane, cultured
Mm.
oil. This is fascinating. Hmm. Well, you've definitely got me curious, Martin. I'm going to have to try it. Thank
Yeah,
you.
you got it. Do it.
Well, that's it for this week, folks. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive four-top episode in which we dove deep into a topic that we've been cogitating on. I am our executive producer, Nick Toole is our producer, and Ruby Welkovich is our media and design manager.
And I am Martín Reyes, Master of Wine, and Keelan King is our sound supervisor and the composer and performer of our fantastic theme music. If you have not already subscribed to the Fort Top on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app, please do so. And please feed that algorithm by leaving us a rating. It also helps new listeners find the Fort Top.
Yes, and please visit our website, thefourtop.org, to learn more about us and stalk us on social media, listen to back episodes, and purchase books written by some of our past panelists. From the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, this is Catherine Cole signing out.
And from the small seaside village of Benicia, California, goodbye.
Bye.